Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity, the podcast that explores what it takes to be well in a busy world. With self-care strategies from Chinese medicine, functional medicine, Ayurveda, neuroscience, and beyond. I'm your host, Brodie Welch, a licensed acupuncturist and transformation catalyst, here to support you on your journey of health, happiness, and personal evolution. Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity. I'm your host, Brodie Welch, and one of the things that I love about having a podcast is getting to talk to people who are working on incredibly interesting things that are helping people heal and getting to learn from them. One of the things that I especially find most interesting is where the modern research explains the stuff that ancient teachings of Chinese medicine were trying to get at. So I'm really excited for today's conversation with Dr. Andrew Miles. Andrew Miles is a doctor of Oriental medicine who grew up with a Taiwanese stepfather, immersed in Chinese culture, martial arts, and medicine. He's studied traditional Chinese medicine in Canada and later lived and trained in Sichuan. He's the host of the Botanical Biohacking podcast, which I have been binging on since discovering it a few weeks ago. One of the things that really piqued my interest, especially, is that really almost turned my whole sense of what Qi is on its head is this term that he refers to called gasotransmitters, which I'm super excited to dive into. Andrew Miles, welcome to A Healthy Curiosity. Thanks for being willing to chat with me today.
Thanks so much for taking the time.
So this notion of Qi that's so central in Chinese medicine is often translated as life force, but you have a different take on that, and I'd love for you to explain it.
Absolutely. So when we look at it in terms of life force, it's not that this is untrue, but we can get more specific with it by simply taking the word at face value, by taking Chinese culture at face value and asking the question, is there a gaseous nature? Are there specific gases which do everything that Qi is supposed to do? In a larger sense, gas is what connects us at the cellular level to the stars. When gases condense, they can form gravity. So there is definitely an electrochemical gaseous component to all energetic exchange in the universe. And when we look at the character for Qi, it's steam coming up off of a rice pot, and a more ancient character is just steam. So when we look at this in terms of the gaseous nature, so you have a rock, but the rock is off-gassing. Ice is also evaporating. Everything is existing in a physical and kind of a gaseous form as it's, as entropy happens. In terms of the human body, gasotransmitters are a group of signaling molecules which serve as helpers, you could say, for nerves. So the nerve fires, but maybe it can't reach a cell. But the gases that it releases as the nerve fires will cross membranes, and then they can relay information across distance.
That is such a fascinating take on really all of it. Right? There's so many different ways that we can think about the body, and that the notion of the body as a sack of meat versus this teeming, ever-changing sea of energy that is constantly changing all the time is usually the first paradigm shift that I invite my patients to step into. But then the idea that it gets even more specific than that, that actually obviously, like when we talk about Qi in Chinese medicine, there are different kinds of Qi that we associate with different organ systems have different jobs, and it does different things. And so we can actually get even more specific as far as what it is we're talking about with respect to gases. It's not just air necessarily. So can you dive a level deeper with me on what kinds of gases are we talking about, and how is it that they can function as neurotransmitters and communicate information at a distance?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I'm just really struck by is in the last few years, you start to see studies saying kidney nitric oxide or liver nitric oxide. And if you just swap that word out, nitric oxide, for a more general term, which it is gas, or in Chinese, Qi, then they're literally talking about kidney Qi and liver Qi and the relationship between these gasotransmitters. So nitric oxide is the most studied, but it's not the only one. There are three of them. There is carbon monoxide, nitric oxide, and hydrogen sulfide. Nitric oxide and hydrogen sulfide are opposite in ways, but they're complementary. So if this sounds familiar to Chinese medicine folks, there's a good reason. Nitric oxide is a oxidative species. It's an oxidant, and hydrogen sulfide is an antioxidant. But in order to really work in the human body, they have to combine. So this is like the alchemical text talking about the the convergence of fire and water. And as these start to combine, then they are both responsible for vasodilation. They both have a modulating effect on the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and are both implicated in most chronic diseases. So most addictions, you have elevated nitric oxide and suppressed hydrogen sulfide. So traditionally, we might see that as liver fire and kidney deficiency. And the other thing is they follow, of course, in Chinese medicine, it's almost like Goldilocks. We have a condition where there's too much qi, where there's too little qi, and where the qi is just right. And if there's too much, it's a problem. If there's too little, it's a problem. In the human body, when there's too much nitric oxide built up in one place, they call it a problem of distribution of gasotransmitters, which in traditional Chinese medicine we call qi stagnation. When it's too low, mitochondria stop being produced. So that's also a problem.
And in fact, when we think about some of the classic signs of qi stagnation in Chinese medicine, it's usually we think about the liver. It's the liver's job to keep everything flowing freely in the body, and that a sign of liver qi stagnation is sighing. And I know you talk a lot about yawning and sighing as just basically, do we have too much pent up energy, or pent up gases that we need to let go of, or do we have not enough energy and we need to take in more from the environment? And that basically that it's like the yin and yang of breath that allows us to do some really basic Qi Gong, right? This idea of exhaling more than we inhale or inhaling more than we exhale as a way of adding to or subtracting from the energy that we either have or we don't.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very easy to get an idea of whether we need to release more or take more in if you just start a practice that's at the foundation of almost every school of Taoism I've heard of. And that's just observing without controlling the breath, which sounds easy, but it can be tricky. But in that observation, you can see, am I exhaling stronger? Is my body wanting to inhale more? As I start to breathe and just watch it, am I yawning or am I sighing? If you can get a sense for this, then it gives you a sense for how to use supplements, how to approach exercise or rest. If you're yawning all the time and trying to supplement, instead of deciding to exercise that day, it may be better to take a nap.
Exactly. Yeah. And really, a lot of times when we're doing that Qigong of simple breath observation, that we'll notice that things will even out as we continue to observe. And the body really wants this. It wants to come back in balance. And a lot of times it's just a matter of turning our attention inward and allowing it to do its thing, as opposed to like overpowering it with what we think we should be doing with our minds.
Mm-hmm.
You offer some really potent and interesting information about the microbiome and molecular mimicry. And I'd love for you to enlighten us as to is just that what do we need to know? Is that obviously we talk a lot about the gut brain axis. We talk a lot about that how the microbiome is important for regulating digestion, but also immunity. And really that there's so much we don't know, right? This is a science in its infancy in Western medicine, and that we're just beginning to discover just how important this is. But I'm curious as to the role that the microbiome and what we need to be paying attention to there.
So first of all, I had a clinic in the United States. I thought that I was fairly competent. Then I went to study in China, and I was observing Jin Zhao, who became my herbal mentor. And there was a case that I saw, and I thought, okay, well, there's dampness there, but really the main thing is what we call kidney deficiency. There are these, the hormones are at suboptimal levels, and it's causing the heart to race. It's causing this insomnia and everything else. So he asked me, what do you think? And I said, well, clearly it's, kidney insufficiency. and you will just knock that damp out of the way first. And he said, you're completely wrong. And I said, what do you mean? And his whole specialization is diving deep into where damp and phlegm in the body are. And he said, the patient isn't 80 years old. She lives in the modern era. If she was over 40, 2,000 years ago in China, yeah, we'll call that kidney insufficiency. But there's no evidence for that right now. He said the dampness is blocking the kidney. And this is a concept I'd never heard of. He said the dampness can block the kidney, the dampness can block the liver, it can block all of the organs. In the heart, it tends to be more with phlegm. But when it blocks the organ function, then it can create these false signs. And there's a saying that for strange diseases, you treat phlegm.
Yes. Yes. And just to bring people into the conversation who might be a little lost by some of the Chinese medicine terminology that we're kicking around here, that dampness is typically thought of as this turbidity. It's like fog in the body that basically prevents it can disrupt the free and easy flow of energy. It can make us feel heavy and weighted down. It can lead to things like cloudy thinking or discharges or just a feeling of heaviness in the limbs. We typically think of it anytime we see anything that's like mucus or if it's sticky and icky and unnecessary and the body's like, what the heck do I do with this? We often would suspect phlegm. And usually it's of dietary in nature. It can also be emotional or like environmental, something that, like lying on damp ground and waking up and feeling stiff and things like that. So this notion of something extra that the body's having a hard time, it lingers, it's heavy, it obstructs. And we typically think about it with respect to, it often shows up as like gas and bloating and things like that we see with digestive issues, as opposed to the signs and symptoms of not enoughness, right? Of not enough coolant, not enough calm in the system that would be leading to that kind of heart racing, insomnia, anxiety, night sweats, things like that. So it is like it's that your take when you your first impression is like textbook spot on that it would be deficiency, and really kind of radical that a Chinese medicine practitioner would go to dampness for that kind of a symptom. But it makes a lot of sense, and I'd love to hear more about how dampness does in fact obstruct the kidneys.
I started to look at the pharmacology of the herbs that he was using because my wife, Shui Lan Qiu, has her PhD in herbal pharmacy. So I was able to get that information fairly easily. And as I looked into it, all of the herbs he was using are highly antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral, but they also mainly deal with water metabolism. In the last few years, the relationship of the gut-brain axis has become increasingly clear. And the way that he was able to treat some really serious diseases with very simple formulas that are geared toward water metabolism at the time blew my mind, but now are coming into focus. And as we look at the role of gut bacteria and the way that they can participate in what's being called molecular mimicry, means that they can hijack the body to get themselves and their offspring what they need, which may be more adrenal hormones. It may be to mess with the thyroid. And while everybody is saying, well, the thyroid is low, we've got to supplement the thyroid, or their T is low, we've got to supplement testosterone. Qingjiao started to see a lot of people after they had seen prominent doctors who said, oh, this person's low on something. And the situation didn't behave as it normally did. So maybe everybody else is getting energized and this person seems to get worse. So when it doesn't really work out the way that it's supposed to, that's often a sign that there's something that's stuck that's blocking that supplementation. And usually at the root of this is what we traditionally call dampness. Today we would think about, maybe the fungi, the molds, the yeasts, and the mycotoxins and the way they engage in molecular mimicry to fool us.
So interesting and kind of evocative of that like goo parasites theory that they're anything that it's this idea that something is inside of us and it has its own demands and it wants us to do things that aren't necessarily good for us so that it can get its needs met. But that yeah, it makes a lot of sense that there is much more excess in our society than there is deficiency, and that something might be Well, taking over as too big of a part of our ecosystem, whether that's a mold or a yeast or something that's clamoring for its own well-being at the expense of its host.
Absolutely. And these ideas are, they didn't come from Jinzhou. They actually came during the Mongolian Yuan dynasty when China as a whole moved from a plant based society to a pastoral society, or the diet became pastoral, so that people were eating ice cream. They were having literal pizzas. They were having fermented yogurt. They were drinking a lot of the foods that we may associate with modern America in terms of, maybe they didn't exactly have a cheeseburger, but if you look at the percentages of dairy and meat, it comes really close to what we have today. And people were treating diseases like bipolar disorder in a completely different way. They were actually approaching the body by way of looking at the mucus. And today, recent research has shown that the mucosal biofilms in the body, when they get out of whack, they can contribute to schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So in many ways, we've come full circle. And the understanding that in many ways our diet is very similar to what it was in the Yuan dynasty, we can look at that era specifically for answers for our so-called modern challenges today.
Right, because even though in Chinese medicine it wouldn't have been described with the language of this herb is for disrupting the biofilm of this particular organism, but that may well be what actually is happening with herbs that may transform dampness, correct?
Absolutely. And the idea of, let's say, the Chinese word for wind, inside the character is a character of a bug or an insect. So even though maybe they didn't outright have the technology to look for it, there was an understanding that creepy stuff grows in damp, dark areas. And they kind of had an idea that it was some kind of small bug.
So interesting. And so, are there things that a layperson could be aware of as far as their lifestyle and diet to make it less likely that some of these, to have pathogenic overgrowth of these things that mess not only with our digestion, our immunity, but potentially also our minds?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of lifestyle practices that are done within Sichuan and very moldy areas of China that most people know. It's kind of home therapy stuff. And that's how people live with chronic mold exposure. Most of the population has had mold exposure to a pretty significant degree just because of the climate. So keeping the windows open, keeping everything clear, that's actually the basis for the idea of feng shui. Or, people will say, okay, this is how you decorate your house to make it lucky. But the original idea is basically don't get mold so you get sick. So a lot of these cultural practices of dusting, keeping your environment clean is reducing environmental toxicity. So that's always a good idea. Another one is to make sure that you're sweating at least once a day, you're breaking a sweat.
Sweating being a way that we're getting rid of toxins.
Yeah, and there's I forget what the compound is, but it's inside of sweat, and when it comes outside, when it's sweated out, then it causes your body to have more of a specific than non-specific immune response. And one of the problems with dampness and extracellular fluid building up and edema and all of these kind of disorders of water metabolism is that the body responds with a generalized immune response. And then this starts to further destroy the cells, which then start to leak. And then it's just kind of a downward spiral. But by sweating even a little bit, breaking a sweat, just bundling up and breaking a sweat, that can already start to help to reverse this cycle.
Really, really simple. And for most of us, probably pretty easy to implement. This episode of A Healthy Curiosity is brought to you by my 5-day Qi Gong challenge, or mini class, because really, who needs another challenge in their lives? Qi Gong is about breathing and moving mindfully. It can help you feel calm, centered, energized, focused, and peaceful, as well as being useful for a whole host of health conditions. I've created super short, simple videos to introduce you to Qi Gong, yoga's less sexy, less popular cousin who is wildly underestimated. You can do Qi Gong anywhere with no special equipment and no stretchy pants required. Visit my website, brodiewelch.com/explore, and sign up for this 5-day Qi Gong mini class that you can do in just 5 minutes a day. Again, that's brodiewelch.com, Brodie with an IE and Welch with a CH, /explore. I know that you specifically, or that you have a course on fibromyalgia, and you work a lot with people who are dealing with chronic pain and also the things that go along with that, which could include sleep issues and which could include a whole host of things, as fibromyalgia can present differently. But for those people, it may be harder to get moving and to break a sweat. And any advice for them?
Yeah, one of the best ways that I've found out of all of the types of Qi Gong or yogic techniques that I found is having people, first of all, bundle up and then lie down on a bed with a pillow under the neck so that the chin gets as close to the chest as possible while still remaining comfortable. And then beginning with just kind of following the breathing, deeply relaxing. And then eventually they'll get to where they're going to do a basic yawning breath. So they're going to breathe very gently from the diaphragm up into the chest, and they should feel a stretch in the back of the neck as this is happening. And then they hold their breath gently. It shouldn't be causing a panic or anything like that. It should be very gentle for 15, then gradually working their way up to 20 seconds and then 30 seconds. And this breath holding will start to activate heat in the body. If you want to see a more extreme example of this, you can look at Wim Hof's method, which is based on the same principle. And that's when we engage in this intermittent hypoxia, it increases the levels of nitric oxide. Nitric oxide begins to, at the sweet spot, begins to turn fat into heat. And this is also very antifungal, antiviral, and it helps with the water pumps in the body. So at the same time, they can start to kill the latent pathogens. They also begin to restore healthy water metabolism. And if they do it just right, they'll break a light sweat. So generally, they'll do maybe 8 breaths like this 3 times a day. And this is all that we do for stage 1. And the idea is they're bedridden, they're in pain, they can barely do anything but lie there. And as they're lying down, they can start to begin their journey toward health by just starting with the brief intermittent hypoxia. Afterwards, the nitric oxide levels rise, and then their hemoglobin gets more efficient and their energy levels rise because then they're able to have more oxygen in their system.
What a wonderful gift you've just given us, a really specific practice that could be really great for people who have very limited options on getting moving and activating the immune response. When you were studying in China, I'm curious whether there are other either herbs that people just know about or cook with on a regular basis that we could really use more of in this culture. And granted, of course, in our medicine, there is no one size fits all. Everyone needs to be taking X, Y, or Z thing because we all have a different ecosystem and a different imbalance going on. But I'm curious if from your travels, what you feel like could really benefit American society.
So the biggest thing I would suggest is just using the spice rack and investing in fresh spices. Sichuan peppercorn is, of course, used extensively in Sichuan. It's very antifungal, so if people are having dampness, then that's good. But also just understanding how to use fresh ginger. There's a saying that fresh ginger tea in the morning is a panacea. It can cure 10,000 illnesses, but taking it at night is a poison. And the idea with that is the way it affects blood circulation. You want to be activating blood circulation in the morning, but at night you want the blood circulation coming more toward the interior. So that's why even with something like ginger, you can make really good use of that and get pretty dramatic effects.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And ginger is such a powerful digestive herb that has that capacity for warming and energizing, and that is mild enough so that even if you are someone who is dealing with too much heat, it's like it's heat in the right place. It's heat in the form of power in the middle burner, which is where we need it in order to digest our food, in order to be able to make use of the good stuff that we're putting in. And absolutely, timing is that notion of getting in alignment with natural cycles and not doing things. We shouldn't be revving up before bed. We shouldn't be doing vigorous exercise. We shouldn't be watching super stimulating things on television that are revving us up and kind of making it more difficult for us to fall into rhythms with nature, which is really at the heart of what Chinese medicine has to teach us, is that we
Mhm.
can live in harmony or we can live out of harmony.
Right.
And that idea. Tell me more about Sichuan peppercorns.
Sichuan peppercorns are, well, they are kind of numbing and they also cause a tingling and vibrating sensation.
I remember listening to one of your podcasts where you talk about a specific level of hertz that they cause the body to vibrate at. I was like, what?
Yeah, they said
So
it's
cool.
similar to 50 hertz. Yeah.
So again, probably not right if someone already feels like they're vibrating internally, or if someone has a lot of wind in Chinese medicine or heat.
It's actually okay.
It
That's why
is.
it's
Okay.
used dietarily, because it's bringing the heat to the middle, to the digestive organs. And as a result of that, it seems to be pretty moderating. You mentioned before about what's something with people, for people who have fibromyalgia, this kind of chronic pain. Another way that you can use the Sichuan peppercorns is to put them into a bag with 50% salt, 50% Sichuan peppercorns, get them hot, and just put it on wherever there's pain. Another way you can use them is to throw them in some oil for a couple of weeks. My mother-in-law uses this quite a bit, and then she'll use this for arthritis on her knees because they have such a pain-killing effect. In terms of herbs that are just easy to access, basically wherever there are Chinese people on the planet, you'll be able to find Sichuan peppercorns because they're just an important part of everyone's life.
And they're used culinarily as well as in packs or topically.
Yeah, with almost every meal. And I
Yeah.
know people who have fibromyalgia and they just cope with it, and they notice that it drops their pain.
Awesome. I love that. I noticed you also have on your website a whole section devoted to foot soaks. And I'm curious as to why that is.
So, foot soaks, I didn't understand their place in Chinese medicine until I really lived in China. But even then, I didn't understand its history until Lan has a classmate, his name's Feng Benhua, and he was a master's level student. And he graduated with his master's degree in Chinese medicine, and it made the news because he opened a foot soak place. Now, foot soak places are usually considered kind of peasant medicine. It's kind of looked down upon. But he had paid quite a bit of money because there was a man. He was near the border of China and Tibet, an area in Sichuan where the border has crossed the people there for literally 1,000 years. It's gone back and forth. So the people there kind of use a hybrid of Chinese and Tibetan medicine. So he paid quite a bit of money. He got these foot soak recipes, and then he started to use them and opened up a chain of clinics. And he was able to take out really serious diseases very quickly by using these foot soaks. And then it was about 10 years passed, and he had gone back to school to get his doctorate and was just going in a different direction. And I asked him if this would be, if it would be okay if I continued to use this. And he said, yeah, that would be great. So we started to use these foot soaks and started sourcing them in the Tibetan Plateau. In this area, I have relatives up there. We actually go up there with a research team from 2 universities and make sure, first of all, that it's completely clean. It's also harmonious socially. So, I get good and drunk with the Tibetan chieftains, and they're very much on the same page with all of this, because we want to make sure that we're sustainably wildcrafting with respect to Tibetan culture. So we've managed to do that, and as a result, we're supplying about 1,000 clinics in 15 countries. And the results have been really great. And no, it's not a cure-all, but it takes out a lot of what's blocking and improves microcirculation. And it's really a great place to start when people have tricky digestion and maybe they aren't responding so well to internal herbs or supplements.
So, how does that work exactly? I mean, it seems like it would that a strength of a foot soak might be that somebody doesn't have to digest it. So if digestion is weak, it's a way around that. But how can, for someone who might not be familiar with the practice, tell us a little bit about how it could even work?
Okay, so you start with a basin or a bucket that should go at least above the ankles, but a little bit below the knee. And boiled herbs are placed in there, and then it's allowed to cool until it's about 110 degrees. In the US and Western countries, it's usually more like 102. And then over time, people will just keep adding hot water until it gets up to around 110. the heat will start to rise up, first of all, through the skin, and then people get an initial kind of flush. It's relaxing, it feels nice. And as the vasodilation starts, then the alkaloids, terpenes, and volatile oils start to soak in transdermally. One of the herbs is Tibetan Shichangpu, Acorus, which increases neurogenesis. So a lot of times as people get older, there's nerve deterioration, there's neural deterioration in the brain. So this is like a nootropic that's also calming people down.
And it's one that we use internally for things for dispelling that phlegm, misting the mind, right? Or like that for brain fog or for confusion, things like that.
Absolutely. And clinically, I use this quite a bit because if people come in and they have brain fog, it doesn't matter what I tell them, they won't remember anything.
Exactly. So you just sit them down, have them soak their feet.
Yeah, exactly. And then the first time they soak the feet, it should be about 30 minutes. If it's, let's say they have high blood pressure, then you might do it only 20 minutes to basically just increase the vasodilation, but not so much as it will increase the cardiac contractility. Then, the practitioner kind of decides, but it's usually between 20 to 30 minutes, definitely not over 45. And then the soaks are done every day. So they have foot soak clinics all through Sichuan in the Tibetan plateau, and they're used quite a bit for pain and cardiac problems, even insomnia. But the course of treatment is generally every day for 2 to 3 months. And when people do them correctly, they should be pouring sweat. So one of the complications with chronic diseases is that they follow an injury. People get a knee injury, they can no longer go jogging, right? But the water metabolism needs to be causing these people, it depends on the sweating. And yet they're not doing that. Their heart rate isn't getting up. But the heat and the herbs allow that to happen anyway, which is important for the healing response. And this increases VEGF, so there's more angiogenesis, there's more blood vessel formation. And as that happens over time, after about 2 weeks, they put their feet in increasingly hotter water. And instead of their feet feeling hot and their hands feeling cold, as soon as they're putting their feet in the hot water, their hands start to warm up. And there's better communication in the body. So we talked earlier about the intracellular communication or the intracellular distribution of those gasotransmitters. That allows intracellular communication. That allows your body to work as a team, so that when there's heat there, the heat's getting distributed everywhere else, which also means that the blood circulation is great and then the gasotransmitters become more optimized.
That makes so much sense. That basically you're increasing the communication, the ability for the body to be this integral whole. And we think about the essentially, well, for those not familiar with Chinese medicine, we think about the sanjiao, right? The triple burner or the triple heater, this which is often described as the systems of sluices and waterways that regulates the water metabolism in the body, and that provides this link between water and fire, and that we need in order for there to be communication between all the parts of the body. It sounds like this would have a lot to do with the water metabolism, the communication, and helping out the whole. It strikes me as a very Sanjiao beneficial kind of a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sanjiao, today they're looking at the respiratory microbiome, the GI microbiome, and the urogenital microbiome as the upper, middle, and lower parts of the body. So traditionally, those are called the upper, middle, and lower burners. And that's a little bit strange to think about, but when we think of this area being rich in endothelium, that's what's producing the nitric oxide. And in addition to that, the nitric oxide and other gasotransmitters are feeding various bacteria, and bacterial colonies, as anybody who's had a compost pile knows, can get extremely hot. So when we talk about these burners in the body, they are these heat sources because of the endothelium and the way that they're producing the gasotransmitters. They're really these kind of metabolic, well, they're metabolic microbiomes. They're like 3 batteries in the body in a very literal sense.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And also often translated like in Qi Gong practices as transformational spaces or alchemical burning spaces. And this idea that they could each in fact have a different job, that we need all 3 to work together in order to have health and balance in the body. With the rise, you mentioned earlier this idea that getting super specific on thyroid or testosterone or particular hormonal imbalances isn't necessarily the way to go, because all of these things work together and all of these things exist in response to uh, really everything else that's going on in the body. And similarly, I see that with gut flora and or with people wanting to understand their microbiome. I get questions from patients wondering whether they need to pay for expensive labs to tell them exactly what they have going on, and overgrowth of this or inefficient or not enough of that. And I'm curious, like, what your approach is when somebody comes in and maybe they know their digestion is a little off, maybe they have an autoimmune thing going on, maybe that, but they're still pretty functional, but there's also that definitely things are going wrong with the body. Do you think that we need to get hyper specific about what's going on, or are there some basics that we can start with?
So there are people in China who they go to see a doctor, and the doctor is just really interested in the water metabolism. That's the biggest difference, I'd say, between Chinese medicine in East Asia versus in the West, is that in East Asia, it's understood a little more tangibly as farming. So it's where's the water? And they do that with tongue and pulse, and mainly just questions. So do you have dry mouth? Are you feeling thirsty? Well, yes or no, or is your GI tract, is it functioning well? Do you have yellow urine? Is there any, just asking these questions about sweating and about general water metabolism. That's the first level of screening, because if something is wrong there, then you don't necessarily go deeper. But if everything is fine in those areas, then you might go looking a little deeper to say, okay, what's the relationship in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and then really going a little more into the endocrine system that way. But initially, the idea is to get rid of, take care of the water first. An analogy I use for that is if you imagine a dilapidated house, and it's not hard to do if you hike at all in Oregon, because you can often come across houses that are just become, overgrown with blackberries and they're halfway part of a hill. But you see that the first thing that goes wrong with a house is that the windows break and it gets flooded. And when that happens, if you were to come in and say, okay, I'm going to renovate this house, I'm going to rip up the floorboards, I'm going to put in a new oak floor, and I'm going to cover it with, I'm going to put a Persian carpet in there. The place it feels amazing for about 2 weeks, and then it rains. And now the entire area has water damage, and the carpet that you spent so much on that you thought was going to last for three generations, it's gathering mold. You got raccoons going through everything. Until you take care of the water problem and the immune system, which would be like fixing the windows, you're just going to be going from doctor to doctor to doctor, and the symptoms will keep returning. So that's why it's good to screen for that first.
Okay. And I'm trying to, as you're saying that, I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. And disease nemesis theory. How do we know that that what's going on with the water metabolism isn't in response to heat or inflammation in the body somewhere, and that's what we actually need to be in, that the pathological, what's going wrong with the water is in response to the body trying to put out a fire.
So as a rule, if you look at somebody and they've got a little bit of, let's say that they're obese by rural Chinese standards. If they look like they, just walked out of, let's say, a Vietnamese rice paddy, that's really thin like that, those people are all fire. I used to treat a lot of Shaolin monks, and I would do acupuncture anywhere on the body, and blood would squirt out. These guys were just fire, and blood would just want to come out. For the majority of Americans who can afford to take care of their health, you're generally not looking at that. So I have seen people who have, maybe they're on the coast in Oregon and they're like mushroom pickers, and they spend all of their time walking up and down hills, sweating constantly. Then yeah, definitely the inflammation will come first. Generally speaking, though, it's usually problems of water metabolism for most modern people.
And if people are struggling with water metabolism, what this may sound like a really basic question, but what should they be doing with respect to their consumption of water?
Forced water is usually what's recommended. So people will say get, however many liters a day that they're supposed to get. One of the problems is when water metabolism starts to break down, people get internal flooding. So they're thirsty, but they don't actually feel like drinking, or they get a dry mouth, even though they have some water retention in the body, which you can tell by looking at the tongue, and you can see that there are ridges on the tongue, or the tongue is fat. So you know, okay, there's actually some edema there, or some, beginnings of what will later become edema. And then you just kind of start there, and don't force the water. Yeah, sure, reducing salt a little bit is good, but the number one thing to do is actually focus on the lungs, because those are very important for the distribution of water. And the lungs are one of the main organs. The lungs and large intestine are the main places that nitric oxide is produced in that endothelial tissue in the body. So anything you can do to open up the lung capacity, like if you go to a sauna and you're sweating, you just feel like, wow, I can breathe much easier. Then you've already done what's called opening the lungs. You've increased that bronchodilation. And that's very important for water metabolism. And it's probably one of the more overlooked. I mean, yes, there are diuretic herbs and, hit the Pedialyte and increase the potassium. All that stuff is good. I'm just addressing what most people tend to overlook, which is the lung function itself.
And certainly easy enough to do. And so I love the fact that there are so many things that are, it's really easy to overlook breathing, for that matter. And, it's one of the most important sources of energy that we have available to us always. And but because it's easy, it's free, it's something we can do ourselves, and we can do it anytime. It's really easy to overlook that it might actually be powerful.
Mm.
I've learned so much from this conversation, and I've really appreciated it. If people are intrigued and they want to learn more about what it is that you are doing, where would you have them go?
I would probably suggest that you check out the Botanical Biohacking podcast and, look for some episodes that might interest you, and yeah, check it out. There are a few good ones and a lot of mediocre ones, but hopefully the ones that you find are appealing.
But so interesting. I personally have really loved it, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you in person here today, Dr. Andrew Miles. Thank you so much for joining me.
Likewise. Thank you, Brodie.
Thanks for listening today. To check out the show notes, get on my email list, or drop me a line, head to brodiewelch.com. That's Brodie with an IE and Welch with a CH. I'd love to hear from you. If you learned something new or feel inspired to try something different in your life, I'd love for you to pay it forward by sharing this episode with a friend who you think could also benefit, and give them a reason to listen. You'll be helping to create a world where we encourage each other to embody self-respect. Till next time, be good to yourself.